Advise on initial contact. You have information, Victor. Singapore Changi Airport. Addis information, Victor. Time 1032 Zulu. Wind 180 at 10. Visibility 21. Temperature 30. Dew point 25. QNH 1007 remarks. No pattern work. No light aircraft accepted at this time. Landing runways 20 right and 20 center. Departing runway 20 center. Advise on initial contact. You have information, Victor. Singapore Changi Airport. Addis information, Victor. Time 103. Singapore Changi Ground. Jordanian 722 Romeo Juliet Heavy. Ready for pushback with information, Victor. Jordanian 722 Romeo Juliet Heavy. Pushback approved. Tail to the north. Pushback approved. Tail to the north. Jordanian 722 Romeo Juliet Heavy. Pushback approved. Tail to the south. Runway 20 center. China Southern 318. Thank you. Good day. United 827. Singapore Changi Ground. China Southern 318. Ready to taxi to runway 20 center with information, Victor. China Southern 318. Taxi to runway 20 center. Contact Tower 1 ready. Thank you. Good day. Singapore 851 Sierra Quebec. Taxi to runway 20 center. China Southern 318.
Singapore Changi Ground, Petite 407, ready for pushback with information, Victor.
Singapore 005 Super. Request frequency change. Petite 407. Pushback approved. Tail to the west. Singapore Changi Ground. Delta 629 Papa Quebec. Request taxi to A2 at the other terminals.
Pushback approved. Tail to the west. Petite 407.
Singapore 005 Super. You were already instructed to change frequency. Delta 629 Papa Quebec. Taxi to A2 via. Taxiing to A2 via Delta 629 Papa Quebec. Singapore Changi Ground. Jordanian 722 Romeo Juliet Heavy. Ready to taxi with information, Victor. Jordanian 722 Romeo Juliet Heavy. Taxi to runway 20 center. Contact Tower 1 ready. Singapore Changi Ground. Singapore 682. Ready for pushback. Requesting runway 20 center. Singapore Changi Ground. Singapore 308 Super. Ready to taxi with information, Victor. Taxi to runway 20 center. Jordanian 722 Romeo Juliet Heavy. Singapore 308 Super. Taxi to runway 20 center. Contact Tower 1 ready.
Singapore Changi Ground. Qatari 911 Heavy. Ready for pushback with information, Victor.
Singapore 682. Pushback approved. Tail to the north. Taxi to runway 20 center. Singapore Changi Ground. EVA 517 Heavy. Ready for pushback with information. EVA 517 Heavy. Pushback approved. Tail to the north. Singapore Changi Ground. Singapore 10 Golf. Ready for pushback. Singapore 10 Golf. Pushback approved. Tail to the south. Pushback approved. Tail to the south. Singapore 10 Golf.
Singapore Changi Ground, Petite 407, ready to taxi with information, Victor.
Petite 407. Taxi to runway 20 center. Contact Tower 1 ready.
Taxi to runway 20 center, Petite 407.
Singapore Chang.
Pushback approved. Tail to the north. EVA 517 Heavy.
Singapore Changi ground. Tunisa 327 Heavy. Request taxi to A3 at the other terminals.
Tunisa 327 Heavy. Taxi to A3 via Victor.
Taxi into A3 via Victor. Tunisa 327 Heavy.
Qatari 911 Heavy. Taxi to runway 20 center. Contact Tower 1 ready.
Taxi to runway 20 center. Qatari 911 Heavy. Thank you. Good day. Tunisa 327 Heavy. Singapore Changi.
Singapore Changi ground. EVA 517 Heavy. Ready to taxi to runway 20 center with information Victor. China Eastern 2613 Heavy. Pushback approved. Tail to the south.
Pushback.
EVA 517 Heavy. Taxi to runway 20 center. Contact Tower 1 ready. Taxi to runway 20 center. EVA 517 Heavy. Singapore Changi ground. Singapore 682. Ready to taxi to runway 20 center. Singapore 682. Taxi to runway 20 center. Contact Tower 1 ready. Taxi to runway 20 center. Singapore 682. Thank you. Good day. Delta 629 Papa Quebec. Singapore Changi ground, Delta Echo Sierra India Oscar, ready for pushback with information Victor, requesting runway 20 center. Delta Echo Sierra India Oscar, pushback approved, tail to the east. Pushback approved, tail to the east, Delta Echo Sierra India Oscar. Singapore Changi ground, Indonesia 6450, request taxi to parking. Indonesia 6450, taxi to parking, at your discretion. Taxi to parking, Indonesia 6450. Singapore Changi ground, Reunion 81, ready for pushback with information Victor. Reunion 81, pushback approved, tail to the south. Pushback approved, tail to the south, Reunion 81. Singapore Changi ground, Singapore 943, request taxi to A2 at the other terminals. Singapore 943, taxi to A2 via Victor 10. Taxiing to A2 via Victor 10, Singapore 943.
Singapore Changi ground, Singapore 170, request taxi to B10 at the other terminals.
Singapore 170, taxi to B10 via.
Taxiing to B10 via, Singapore 170.
Singapore Changi ground, Singapore 18 Super, ready for pushback. Singapore 18 Super, pushback approved, tail to the north. Singapore Changi ground, Jetstar Asia 001, ready for pushback with information Victor. Singapore Changi ground, Singapore 750, ready for pushback with information Victor. Pushback approved, tail to the north, Singapore 18 Super. Jetstar Asia 001, pushback approved, tail to the north.
Singapore Changi ground, China Eastern 2613 heavy, ready to taxi with information Victor.
Pushback approved, tail to the north, Jetstar Asia 001. Singapore 750, pushback approved, tail to the west.
Singapore Changi ground, Delta Echo Sierra India Oscar, ready to taxi with information Victor.
China Eastern 2613 heavy, taxi to runway 20 center, contact tower when ready. Pushback approved, tail to the west, Singapore 750. Delta Echo Sierra India Oscar, taxi to runway 20 center, contact tower when ready. Singapore Changi ground, Singapore 195 Super, request taxi to E28 at the other terminals. Singapore 170, expect progressive taxi instructions.
Roger, Singapore 170.
Taxi to runway 20 center, Delta Echo Sierra India Oscar.
Singapore 405 Papa Romeo, contact Singapore approach on 124.6. Singapore 083, maintain slowest practical speed. Maintain slowest practical speed, Singapore 083. China Southern 318, line up and wait runway 20 center. Line up and wait runway 20 center, China Southern 318. Ethiopian 638 heavy, when able turn left and contact ground, please expedite, traffic on final. Thank you, good day, Korean Air 465. Singapore Changi Tower, Singapore 682, ready for departure at runway 20 center, departing west.
Singapore Changi Tower, Singapore 875 heavy, inbound on the ILS runway 20 right with information Victor.
Wilco, Ethiopian 638 heavy.
Singapore Changi Tower, Korean Air 465, inbound on the ILS runway 20 center with information Victor. Singapore 682, line up and wait runway 20 center. Singapore Changi Tower, Singapore 2398 is 11 nautical miles to the northeast at 3,000 feet, inbound for landing with information Victor. Singapore 875, EVA 517 heavy, say intentions. Number 1, cleared to land, runway 20 center, Korean Air 465. Singapore 308 Super. Singapore Changi Tower, EVA 517 heavy, ready for departure at runway 20 center, departing east. Singapore Changi Tower, please double check runway assignment. Contacting Singapore approach on 124. EVA 517 heavy, hold short of runway 20 center. Holding short runway 20 center, EVA 517 heavy. Cleared for takeoff, runway 20 center, China Southern 318. Singapore 682, line up and wait runway 20 center. Line up and wait runway 20 center, Singapore 682. Singapore 682, wind 190 at 11, runway 20 center, cleared for immediate takeoff. Singapore 682, please expedite. China Southern 318, contact Singapore approach on 124.6.
Singapore Changi Tower, Singapore 028 Alpha Kilo Heavy, inbound on the ILS runway 20 right.
Contacting Singapore approach on 124.6, China Southern 318. Singapore 028 Alpha Kilo Heavy, wind 190 at 11, number 1, runway 20 right, clear to land.
Number 1. Cleared to land. Runway 20 right. Singapore 028 Alpha Kilo Heavy.
EVA 517 Heavy, request frequency change. I'm sorry, EVA 517 Heavy.
Singapore Changi Tower, Reunion 81.
Singapore Changi Tower, EVA 517 Heavy, ready for departure at runway 20 center, departing east. Contacting Singapore approach on 124.6, Singapore 682. Korean Air 465, exit runway when able, contact ground on the taxiway. Reunion 81, hold short of runway 20 center.
Holding short runway 20 center, Reunion 81.
Wilco, Korean Air 465. Thank you, good day, Korean Air 465. EVA 517 Heavy, wind 190 at 11, runway 20 center, cleared for takeoff. Cleared for takeoff, runway 20 center, EVA 517 Heavy. Singapore Changi Tower, Singapore 18 Super, ready for departure at runway 20 center, departing north.
Singapore Changi Tower, Scooter 223, inbound on the ILS runway 20 center.
Reunion 81, line up and wait runway 20 center.
Line up and wait runway 20 center, Reunion 81.
Singapore Changi Tower, Singapore 9 Heavy, ready for departure at runway 20 center, departing west.
Scooter 223, wind 190 at 11, number 1, runway 20 center, cleared to land.
Number 1, cleared to land, runway 20 center, Scooter 223.
Singapore 9 Heavy, hold short of runway 20 center. Reunion, EVA 517 Heavy, contact Singapore approach on 124.6.
Singapore Changi.
Contacting Singapore approach on 124.6, EVA 517 Heavy. Singapore approach, EVA 517 Heavy, with you at 2000. Singapore Center, EVA 517 Heavy, with you at 2900. Singapore Center, Vietjet 602, with you at 33,000. Singapore 785 is 30 nautical miles northwest of Kerda at 28,000 feet, requesting ILS approach runway 20 center at Singapore Changi.
Singapore Center, Delta Romeo Alpha Zulu Echo, with you at 44,000.
Qantas 5 Charlie Echo is 26 nautical miles northeast of Raja Haji at 19. Singapore arrival, EVA 517 Heavy, with you at 5,400. Singapore Center, EVA 517 Heavy, with you at 5,700.
Delta Romeo Alpha Zulu Echo, requesting descent via Opgo 1 Bravo arrival.
EVA 517 Heavy, radar contact.
EVA 517 Heavy is 6 nautical miles northwest of Batam Hang at 7,800 feet, requesting flight following to Taiwan Taoyuan. Singapore 785 is 21 nautical miles west of Kedah at 28,000 feet, requesting ILS approach runway 20 center at Singapore Changi.
EVA 517 Heavy, flight following request not required after check-in.
EVA 517 Heavy, requesting climb to flight level 360.
Singapore Center, Singapore 926 Super, with you at 31,700.
Morgan 337, requesting climb to flight level 320.
Singapore Center, Singapore 882 Super, with you at 41,400.
Norland 337, contact Kuala Lumpur Center on 127.0. Sierra Tango Sierra Echo November, contact Singapore arrival on 119.3. EVA 517 Heavy, altitude at your discretion. Singapore 926 Super, radar contact. Delta Romeo Alpha Z.
Thank you, EVA 517 Heavy.
Descending via Opgo 1 Bravo arrival, Delta Romeo Alpha Zulu Echo.
Echelon 003 Mike Uniform, you're in an active airspace. Please contact Singapore Center on 127.0. Niugini 392 Heavy, you're in an active airspace. Please contact Singapore Center on 127.0. Singapore 882 Super, frequency change approved, good day. Singapore 785, contact Kuala Lumpur Center on 127.0.
Frequency change approved Singapore 882 Super, good day.
Egypt 602, contact Kuala Lumpur Center on 127.0.
Contacting Kuala Lumpur Center on 127.0, Singapore 785. Contacting Kuala Lumpur Center on 127.0, Vietjet 602.